Welcome to the Bilge Pumps. We're a bunch of drip spout ship. Welcome back to Bilge Pumps meets Battlestar Galactica. In part 2, we look at the prospects for flak, EMP, and freaking laser beams.
Target left of firing.
Which brings us to the next topic quite nicely, the very spectacular component of the more recent Battlestar Galactica series was flak.
Yeah.
I have to say, it was nice to see that. He was a ship that didn't just have bright, flashy lights. He was a big cloud of flak that was taking out incoming missiles and fighters. Which made me think, how would that play out in a modern scenario?
I think it's going to be coming back more to that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it's kind of, you got the World War II scenario where it was machine guns, then 20 mil, then 40 mil, and then 3-inch by the end of it. But that was all predicated on, we need to shoot down the aircraft before it drops the weapon. But then once it got to a point where even the aircraft could launch its weapon beyond the range even of a 3-inch or even a 6-inch AA gun with missiles and such, shooting down the aircraft now moved over to the realms of the missile. But if that missile has failed, or the aircraft is stealthy, or for whatever reason the aircraft has begun to launch the weapons, now you have a problem, because shooting down the weapon is much harder than shooting down the aircraft in most cases. And yeah, obviously, yes, you can engage missiles with your own missiles and such, but when it gets back to being close in, you saw the resurgence of the automatic 20mm gun in things like Phalanx, or Cashdown, I think, uses a 30 mil. Mm-hmm. So we're back in that lower realm of things, and in a lot of ways, the principles as compared to like the early World War I principles are pretty much still the same. You're looking at trying to physically take out by direct contact the incoming hostile. It's a missile now instead of an aircraft, but the principle is still the same. And Phalanx does it, fill the air with lead, and if something will hit, hopefully. But we're now, I think, in the same position as we probably would have been in mid-World War II, where people are going, yeah, but you can throw an awful lot of ammunition skyward, but sky is a very big space, and if you're in and obviously if you're in space like in Battlestar Galactica, that doubles, because you now have the below the waterline element, if you like, as well.
And also
so
we have the sort of below the waterline developing also in the UK, in Western navies, because you've got the 30mm is developing an anti-torpedo capability. So we're actually looking at that as well.
Yeah. But you've got all this volume to fill, and no matter how much individual rounds you put out there, you're not going to necessarily guarantee to hit something. At which point, I think in the modern Navy, certainly, the idea of seeing a 40mm or a 57mm weapon or something like that can rapid fire shells almost as quickly, but has a meaningful enough flak burst. So instead of, well, as long as the flight path of this shell and this missile happen to intersect, we're okay. It's now, well, if the missile happens to fly through this much larger cloud of fragmentary debris, we're okay. Because you can suddenly fill up an awful lot more volume with 24 fragmentation 57mm rounds than you can ever do with a Gatling's for spraying 20mm here, there, and everywhere. And I think...
Which is why I'm really actually quite happy with the Type 31 design, because honestly, I think someone's been... Maybe my shouting over the years has finally put it through, because whenever the whole way through their design, and I kept going, these are going to be forward presence ships, task group point defense ships. That's going to be their role. They're not going to be the picket ships. We don't need them for that. What we need them, and they've got a 57mm, 40mm, and a 40mm aft. They are basically a flagship. That's pretty much their role in the, if you consider. What would you be using a Type 31 or that style ship for in wartime? They would be next to my aircraft carrier or my other higher value unit, and their job would be to get between that and missiles and put up a lot of flak. to basically fill the air in front of those ships with lead.
I imagine that flak would have. Okay, so the front profile of a missile is very small, I suppose.
Yeah.
Especially when compared to something like a 500-pound bomb carrying Zero. But it wouldn't take a very substantial piece of hot metal to stop it from doing its job.
No.
It would have a fairly delicate sensor system up the front.
Mm-hmm.
It would have a fairly delicate communication system attached to it somewhere if it's being guided externally. And then it's got these rather small control surfaces.
Plus, it might
probably
have engines and all sorts of other things which can take damage.
Yeah, and also probably a extremely optimized AI algorithm on board that wouldn't know how to handle a bent control surface. So I guess the only counter argument to that immediately jumps to mind is, well, how far out does the flak have to be to stop pure inertia from carrying that weapon through to the target anyway? So you're talking flak that's going to have to be a fairly long range deployment, particularly against something like a hypersonic weapon. Once again, yes, all it takes is a superheated hypersonic weapon to hit probably just some hot air, I suppose, before its control surfaces are no longer viable. But at that speed and at that proximity to the target, it really doesn't matter anymore anyway.
I think the difference is in our world at the moment. I think 57 40mm flak probably actually has far more advantages, because if you think about it ballistically, your shell or whatever is going to go a certain distance before it starts dropping off under gravity, to an extent that you can no longer really compensate or aim the system when you're talking about an incoming high-speed missile. So that's your effective range of how far you can take out the hypersonic. At least with a flak round, if it gets to that point and then it detonates, it's giving at least half of its fragmentation pieces a bit more energy to go a bit further. So, okay, it's an extreme scenario, and the additional ranges are, relatively speaking, minuscule, it'd be a few hundred more meters. But I think it means that flak as a whole doesn't have any range limitations on it as compared to just a solid round. And you have, well, I suppose you also have the other thing of the fact that if you fire a solid round and the solid round or explosive tip round or whatever, the single shot, if it passes through the engagement space where the missile is, or multiple missiles, once it's passed, that's it. There is that it has a zero. It's a binary. Did it hit or not? And end of discussion. Whereas if you have a flak burst ahead of the missile, not only are there multiple possibilities of that interception taking place, but also if you're talking about a cloud of missiles, the fact that you've got a flak burst here, okay, maybe that missile made it through that flak burst, but this other missile that's coming in slightly higher may now be hit by a bit of that flak burst that's now coming up. And that first missile might be hit by a bit of a flak burst from somewhere else that's coming down, or left or right. So you're increasing, mathematically, you're just increasing the number of potential collision events, at which point, statistically, you are going to end up with more hits. And as we said, with a hypersonic weapon, it's going to probably slam its way straight through the fragment and wreck itself anyway.
I wouldn't be surprised if you start getting the ship's guns being automated to do a sort of figure of 8 pattern or something over the target area, rather than just actually aiming for the target, doing a figure of 8 to sort of build a flak field. But the thing is, you're going to have to start thinking about this in terms of the level of firepower. This again gets me back to my point about making them double guns. Because if you are doing this, the trouble is when you're putting in a single gun, when you're talking about shooting to kill, when you're talking about shooting to build a flak field, you need volume of fire. You need volume. That's the reason why the ships end up going out to war, going in World War II. By the end of World War II, they look like hedgehogs. They are literally everywhere. Space that can be is crammed with these guns, because you need volume of fire to put up a dense flak field. And that's what you are doing. You're putting up a field of flak. You're putting in a sort of a wall of metal You know, we talk about the Iron Curtain. Well, this is the real Iron Curtain. It's when you put up a wall of flak and you're basically going, you will have to do a lot of work to get through this.
And I think the other thing is you've got to, I mean, sort of returning to the Battlestar Galactica element, that, to my mind, is actually one of the better elements of its sci-fi combat, because the one disadvantage of a flak field on Earth, on a planet, is gravity. After a relatively short amount of time, you no longer have a flak field because everything just falls to the ground. Whereas in space, especially if you have a flak shell that explodes in a cone forward as opposed to omnidirectional, which is a bit stupid because in space that just means the fragment's going to come straight back at you. But if you've got a directional exploding flak round, you can actually build up a massive curtain of fire, because that's just going to keep going towards the incoming hostile. So you don't need to be trying to intercept the missile by having the flak round explode 10 feet in front of it. You can start off with, and as actually, I think as you actually see in the show, this kind of flak barrier of explosions starts occurring much, much ahead of the incoming, and it stays there as kind of a static barrier, which, although you don't see it in the show in terms of realism, that means every time there's an explosion, there's another wave of metal going out. So that incoming missile now has to go through 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or more waves of flak coming the other way, which again massively increases the amount of the chance of it actually being hit by something. In space, you really can build a full-on wall, and of course, assuming that the incoming vector is roughly the same as the ship that launched it, they've also then got to deal with a lot of micro impacts coming their way, which, okay, if they've got decent hull armor, might not be too much for a problem for their overall structural integrity, but sensor systems are generally a lot more vulnerable.
And which I suppose brings me to another point, which is, you know, a classic example of innovation in World War II. Window. Simply dropping aluminium foil strips in the air to spoof radar.
Yep.
In the Battlestar Galactica Deadlock game, they have a version of Window which they use as a missile defense system. It drops flares, chaff, in a nice neat line where you fly your chaff dropping Raptor, and any incoming missiles are taken out either via impact or via the burst of the flare in that instance. But if it's, you know, I guess it's the same effect, isn't it? If you have Window that's floating there, fluttering away, it's slowly drifting down. Once again, it hits a delicate sensor, it hits a control surface, it tangles into the actuators. Well, all of a sudden you have a less effective weapon.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I actually think with that kind of system is probably, I have a feeling, actually might be more effective these days than it has been in more recent times, because obviously it was very effective in World War II. Then during the Cold War, they started coming up with various radar systems that could see through it, because it was like, well, yes, there is this little radar reflection, and there's lots of these little radar reflections, but honestly, really, we want to be looking at the radar reflection of the 10-meter long fighter, not the 10-inch long bit of aluminium foil, which you could get the radar to do. But on the other hand, these days, you do always hear a lot about, the F-35 or the F-22 or the Rafale or PAC-FA or the J-20. They have a radar cross-section of like a ball bearing or whatever. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at going, well, hang on a minute. If they have the radar cross-section of a ball bearing or a biro or a marble or whatever analogy you want to use, in actual fact, that means they have roughly the same cross-section as radar cross-section as a small piece of aluminium foil. So now, if you develop an anti-stealth radar that goes, well, actually, I'm relatively suspicious of the fact that ball bearings or seagulls don't tend to fly at Mach 1 at 20,000 feet. So this is probably something we should shoot at. All of a sudden, the window, the chaff, this actually now becomes a much more viable defensive option again, because now, if the aircraft launches it, even if it's not necessarily tiny bits of aluminium foil, it may actually be legitimate ball bearings or something. Because let's face it, who cares? You're over in enemy country. Somewhat minor fragmentation bombardment in the end. But if the radar return now has to deal with, well, there are now 4 dozen ball bearing size radar contacts all flying at roughly Mach 1 at 20,000 feet. Which one do I shoot at? Because it has no real way of differentiating one contact from another, because they're all the same size now.
And it could make it think that there's a whole group of enemy aircraft up there, and that could provide cover for your attack elsewhere.
Yeah, and then I mean, obviously, it's this kind of I've never actually found out what the game is called, but you know, the game a lot of you play as kids where everyone puts one hand on top of the other all the way up. It's like it's the equivalent of that game, because that will be the counter to an anti-stealth radar for a while, until somebody pairs the anti-stealth radar with an infrared detection system that can spot the bleed air from your turbines, and then countermeasures will get more sophisticated, and so on and so on and so on, all the way up the line. But I think the next 2 generations of detection measures is going to be someone figuring out a way to make a radar and associated computer system, which loops back to our AI discussion, that can look at these returns and go, actually, yeah, I doubt seagulls are capable of the speed of sound, so I'm going to lock onto this, which to a extent they can do already, but you need a bit more power and fidelity for it to have a useful range. And then someone's going to have to work out a way of countering that, and I think that will probably be the way of countering it.
But then again, okay, that's the traditional usage of chaff. But what about as an alternative or supplement to flak? Because I imagine that sucking a piece of aluminium foil into the turbojet of a cruise missile isn't exactly going to be healthy. And again, with the speeds we're talking about and the control surfaces we're talking about and the sensors we're talking about, smacking into several pieces of, okay, it's not high velocity, but it's still a piece of metal that's fluttering there in front of you.
Yeah, I think this is the one of the weaknesses of the very high speed supersonic hypersonic missiles is the fact that if they do take an impact, because they're going so fast, they are their own worst enemy. Because if you look at what was it called, the very first Russian anti-shipping missile, it's like SSN-3 or something, the one they used to take out that Israeli destroyer, they basically look like slightly small flying, they basically look like slightly small pilotless fighters. If you hit them with a bit of foil, it would be like you're hitting a subsonic jet fighter with a bit of foil, unless it really gets somewhere delicate in the engine. It's not going to matter. It's like, oh yeah, we have a bit of nose decoration, great. Whereas if you're using like a Zircon and it's traveling at Mach 5, all of a sudden the impact of that 0.5 gram of aluminium at Mach 5 is a heck of a lot worse than the same impact at a few hundred miles an hour.
And I can actually see you combining flak and chaff. It's going to sound strange, but the thing we haven't been sort of talking about, which you could do, is if you can produce a shell which is smart enough with exposure, it sort of gives it a sort of a heat register in that area, and you have flak going off, but also you have some sort of foil within those flak shells that are exploding up, you suddenly have a huge radar image bloom up, which might actually even attract the missiles in to your flak field,
or at least block the view of what's behind it.
Yes, and this is the thing. It could turn it into the missile could go, we have spotted the enemy. We're going to dive up. We're going to do our pop-up maneuver, which we've developed to get over the flak field. And instead of them getting over the flak field, they dive into the flak field, which is just brilliant. As far as
or if they lift up to go over the flak field, they then expose themselves to your other defensive systems, your direct fire ones, because they're now taking a different profile, a different flight profile, which might be more amenable for your close-in weapon systems.
And the trouble is, again, with your high-speed system, is if you are doing Mach 5 and you have to do a pop-up maneuver, you're going to go freaking high. You either have to
sell the parts, to be honest.
It also takes a long time for you a lot of distance for that maneuver to carry it out.
Yeah.
Which, but again, as I say, this is why your flak/chaff field will have to be a long way from your ships, because you need to make sure you have that time gap where gravity can take its effect, or that jammed control surface takes its effect, or that blinded sensor can cause you to miss.
And it comes back to
blow itself up.
Yeah, and it comes down to the again to the also the limitations on machine learning that we were discussing earlier, because if you've got the best way if you've got these massive radar blooms suddenly appearing and disappearing all over the place, you can, if you're talking about a smart sensor that's trying to home and track in on the target, in some ways you could almost give the missile the digital equivalent of an epileptic seizure, because you're constantly flashing new images in front of it, and the missile, again, limitations of modern machine learning, it's used to frame, slightly different frame, slightly different frame, slightly different frame, process, track. If you suddenly start throwing random, entirely different bits of information at it, it's going to go, hang on a minute, and it'll start reacting to that, and then it's gone, and it reacts, and it's like,
combine it with the
I'm off.
dazzle flamish, which we talked about earlier, chaff into the flak, and you've suddenly got a scenario where your machine learning super missile is going,
Yeah, but and in actual fact, at that point, the speed of computers versus humans might actually work against it, because even if getting into very dark areas of Warhammer 40,000 at this point, but even if you had a human brain servitor flying the missile, the human mind only responds at a certain speed based on data input. So if it had all this flashy radar signatures popping up, assuming it could only see via the sensors, it might get a bit disconcerted, but it physically can't react fast enough before those clear, and it's like, oh no, I can still see the warship. You might, if it was a human pilot, you might twitch slightly at seeing all this flak in front of you, but as we see in even in World War II, a pilot can just go, actually, I can still kind of see the ship through there, so I'm going to ignore this and plow on through. Whereas a computer can make a decision so fast that actually it can probably make a decision too fast for its own good, because you can end up with a situation where sorry, I had that on silent. The silent ran out. You can end up in a situation where the computer goes, there is this whole new set of information. It processes that information and makes a reaction to that information, and the missile starts to move. And then a split second later, that information is no longer there. And except now the missile's already started this move. Now it has to recorrect and go the other way, because it's reacting at a speed that no human could ever match, but is actually kind of self-destructing. Because as we said, it's again, this does come down to a certain extent to programming limitations. But if you are flying at Mach 5 or whatever, there will be certain maneuvers with your missile where if you pull a turn of, you make the control surfaces go to a certain degree, it will just rip itself apart under inertia. And if you haven't programmed that in properly, or you just forgot, or you didn't imagine that scenario, you could have a missile that literally flies itself apart trying to dodge and weave through flak bursts, at which point, even if you never hit it, you've accomplished your goal.
And that would actually have quite a big impact in terms of your planning, because if you consider our entire planning base, and if you can, especially the American-led side, Western, is based on getting the first strike with the missiles and getting a massive strike with the missiles, both to solve. But if you've suddenly got to deal with the fact that, hang on, there's going to be flak, there's going to be all these things, your first strike with your missiles, it doesn't matter to an extent, because okay, your whole idea of your large striking missiles is you overwhelm the missile defenses because there's only so many missiles they can carry. Ships can carry a whole lot more flak. And you can almost, if you've got enough confidence in it, start going, right then, I will engage with missiles up to this point. Once they close this point, this range, though, I will turn off my missile systems and save them for the next engagement.
And it might also induce the count, as I was saying before, with the whole sort of hand over hand, it introduces counters, because if you can create an environment that's hostile enough that modern missile technology, no matter how much machine learning you give them, is just going to get horribly confused. And let's face it, there's nothing better at causing organized chaos than humans.
It's why I have no fear we would actually win the war with an AI, because they would not be able to deal with the sheer amount of chaos we would create.
But that could lead to new forms of counter weapons, or actually, to be honest, the way a lot of warfare goes, you reinvent old weapons. One of the things I've always thought would be, because all the things we're talking about, gun-based systems, they do run back into the same problem that gun-based systems in the immediate post-World War II era had of limited range. And I keep thinking about a modern version of the Ikara missile. It's a missile carrying a torpedo. Now, it fell out of use for various reasons, but in this kind of scenario, if you've got your long range, sort of almost coach-sized long range cruise missile like Granite or whatever these days, if you think, well, actually, we've got enough defensive systems on here, or just sheer numbers, that it's going to survive through the initial surface-to-air missile barrage, but this complex layered chaff flak electronic and dazzle camouflage systems right up close, and we're probably not going to get through that. Considering the amount of load these things carry, you might as well just go, actually, we're going to carry a torpedo instead. And then once the sensor sees, we're approaching the barrier of death, the missile just goes, well, we're going to jettison the torpedo. As the Americans proved at the end of World War II, you can actually drop a torpedo from a relatively high altitude at a relatively high speed, and it'll still survive. Maybe it'll need a parachute or a bit of retro rockets or whatever, but it could splash down perfectly fine. The missile continues on, and as we've seen with various engagements, including the Falklands, just because the missile doesn't necessarily explode doesn't mean it's not a threat. So that's still going to have to be engaged, even if it's effectively at that point a kinetic kill vehicle with some rocket fuel in the back. And now the ships have to worry about, well, we've got these incoming high-speed airborne threats, but we've now also got a bunch of short-range torpedoes in the water who are all going ping and frantically coming after us. And this suddenly makes things very difficult, because
suddenly your 30mm anti-torpedo cannon is looking really good.
Yeah, but if you look at the way the current systems are set up, if you've got, I mean, it's like most ships' approaches in some ways are very old school to incoming missiles. You turn broadside to unleash the maximum amount of missiles and guns you can at them. But being broadside on a nice steady course is perfect for anti-missile engagement. It's the single worst thing you can possibly do for a torpedo engagement. And now you have a catch-22. Do we leave the ship going nice, straight and level and probably knock down all the missiles, and then we get blown out of the water by a torpedo? Or do we start doing all sorts of fancy swings and dances and variable speeds and dropping decoys and everything to try and desperately throw off all these incoming torpedoes, in which case we're constantly moving in and out of the arcs of fire of our best anti-aircraft defense systems? We probably get nailed by a missile. This is the way you win wars. You force the enemy into a decision-making routine in which neither outcome is good for them. And
it's always a good thing to put a computer into as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
An AI.
Yeah. And to a certain extent, I think it would be a real devil's choice, because most ships can probably survive a missile strike or two, unless it's some bus-sized Mach 5 monster. But very, very few ships are going to survive a torpedo strike these days. So you would have to.
Such a scenario would change entirely your ship design. If you're looking at such a scenario, it would change entirely ship design. It would change what those torpedo bulges, which we were having another discussion before this began, and we were talking about torpedo bulges, and they've completely, of course, gone out of fashion, other than in your aircraft carriers. Well, suddenly you'd be looking at that scenario and going, actually, suddenly the big threat is we can deal with the aviation. We now need to find a way to make the ships more likely to survive that broadside torpedo hit. So we're going to need to strengthen the keel somehow, but we also might want to put bulges back on them.
Yeah, and if you think about it, if you're in a position of a weaker power or an up and coming power, if you can obsolete the entire larger enemy fleet, so what's the R&D cost going to be of a large short-range torpedo carrying cruise missile compared to the R&D cost of our entire US Navy is obsolete? We need to either replace everything or bring them all back in for massive 1930s style modernizations and refits. So even if that weapon never gets fired, the amount of economic damage you've just done to your opponent is colossal.
I'm seriously surprised China and America haven't developed this missile yet.
Yeah, it's probably because they're still obsessed with refighting the Pacific War.
Yeah.
I
should watch more Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah. I know Jamie's much more of a carrier skeptic than I am, but the more and more I look at things, the more and more I do think that there is a bit of a blind spot in a lot of navies where they're just obsessed with refighting the Pacific War Mark II.
Yeah, I agree.
And not taking into account the fact that actually the whole point the Pacific War is such a heavily studied thing is because it was a completely different conflict to World War One, which in turn was a completely different conflict to the last big naval war, probably the Napoleonic Wars, to be honest, if we're talking global. Yeah. Every major naval war has always seen the introduction of brand new weapons systems and technologies that's completely
used
upended
in new ways.
Yeah, what the previous paradigm was. And it doesn't mean that things were completely obsolete. The battleships of World War One still had a role to play in World War Two, but they were no longer the front line after probably 42, late 42, early 43. And if everyone's just invested on, we will have carriers and we will only have carriers and carriers will be the front, and say, well, actually, like, people have spent the last 70 or 80 years working out ways of making sure that doesn't happen. And with the best one in the world beating up on places like Afghanistan and Iraq doesn't really help you inform carrier doctrine. And the last thing you want to do is end up being caught flat-footed. Because can you imagine? Yeah, can you imagine what would happen if you end up in a scenario? Well, actually, no. We know what happens in this scenario, believe it or not. It's like with the new weapon system that in World War II was the carrier comes in by late mid 44. Japan effectively no longer has a carrier arm. I mean, they've got a few hulls, but they haven't got any pilots to put on them, practically speaking. They've got battleships. They've got the biggest battleship they ever built. In fact, they've got two of them. Didn't last too long. When it came up against the new weapon system, they weren't designed for. And I think it's the same thing here. If people ignore new weapons technology, it's only going to take one genius to come up with it. And
so like when people keep going that the submarine is the future of war and it's going to dominate future wars, and I sit there and go, the submarine came of age really in World War One. It did quite well there, but it was more submersible than a submarine. In World War Two, it also does really well there. In the Cold War submarine, but if the nicest way, if you're thinking about it, we've been working out how to kill submarines for well over 100 years now. The idea that if the submarine had going to be the coming way of war, which was going to be the sole provider for future wars and the sole ship for future wars, it would have happened yet. And again, if we go into the Battlestar Galactica Deadlock universe, they have, and I haven't yet got them in the game, but I'm told in other variations of the games they do have them. They have the stealth battle stars and the ships which are designed for stealth, kind of like the submarine is. And they're very good for launching, according to write-ups, these strikes. But there's also a problem that the moment they get caught in a stand-up fight where the enemy knows where they are and they are trying, they don't have the legs to deal with that because they don't have the ability to respond on the same levels which a light Battlestar or a full-on super Battlestar would do so, or any of these things. And I'm sitting there looking at current ship design and current war design, and we're talking about this one with the aircraft carrier not being, and I keep coming back to the idea of the cruiser, of an all-around general-purpose warfighting vessel, and Drax's idea of some minimally manned ships of about frigate, large frigate, small destroyer-sized, which would operate around it as a modern task group. And I think you would still need the aircraft carrier because I think air power is still going to be important. You're going to need the manned and unmanned aviation assets an aircraft carrier can bring. But I think that's part of the network force, maybe with its own 4 or 5 of these minimally manned escorts going around it, and then 4 or 5 cruisers with their groups of minimally manned escorts outside of them, operating as a wider task force and with their own task groups. I see that as a sort of idea you've got coming ahead of you. I don't necessarily see these huge these huge crewed fleets. I've got to train myself to think of this properly. Huge crewed fleets going out there and fighting these battles, like the Pacific War, like the war in the Atlantic, which is far less covered, but also has battle groups going around engaging. The fact that it doesn't happen that often is because the Royal Navy is very good at making sure the Germans are very scared to go out into the Atlantic. The Royal Navy spends a lot of time scaring the bejesus out of them to stop them doing it.
There is another example here of science fiction thinking leading things astray. And I guess that would be the carrier battleship hybrids. So that, on one level, looks like the best answers of both worlds, doesn't it? You've got big guns, you've got lots of armor, and you've got a flight deck with aircraft. Hey, problem solved. But we all know that the fundamental design elements of a battleship are vastly different to the fundamental design elements of a carrier, and therefore the two don't necessarily cross over that well.
I would say on Earth they don't. I'd say in space we could be talking a different scenario, i.e. Battlestar. But
yes, but I'm talking about how
on Earth
this is where the weakness of the science fiction thinking comes in. It doesn't necessarily always lead you down a path of reality. So we've been talking about the appeal of flak. We've been talking about the appeal of chaff, the appeal of loyal boarding crew members. But there's another layer of engineering / battlefield reality here,
and variations
none of the three of us have.
Carracks, of course, as well. We've also been talking about those.
There are instances, I think, where in some ways science fiction can lead people astray in thinking of certain things. But I think, to be honest, of all the things where it's probably led people astray, it's probably been lasers. Because lasers got into science fiction, at least in visual form science fiction. Yeah, I mean, you start off with the heat ray, but I'm thinking of like in the kind of sci-fi space opera style stuff you start seeing with like Flash Gordon, Star Wars, original flavor, Battlestar Galactica. Well, actually not, and maybe not so much there, but the laser, the phaser, whatever energy beam you call it, in a lot of ways in visual sci-fi came about because it was easier to do. It was much easier to film, animate, post-production than gunfire or missiles or whatever. It looks cool and it has certain applications, etc. But if you look at the number of false starts that laser weaponry has had over the decades, a lot of it is probably down to people going, I've seen this thing in sci-fi, I want to make this thing in sci-fi. I mean, okay, to a certain extent, the whole sort of Star Wars defense system in the 80s was a bit of a bluff. But at the same time, how much money did they pour into that laser mounted on a Boeing 747? And the various lasers they did actually legitimately try and make work for satellites and stuff. The technology just was not advanced enough then for the kind of stuff they were talking about doing for the Reagan era space defense system. It's probably still not advanced enough now, and we've been working on lasers for pretty much that's as long as my lifetime.
And I guess that's the fundamental problem, isn't it? Every researcher, scientist, engineer that you ask is always going to say, "Oh, we can get this to you in 5 years," because that's a nice budget cycle, isn't it?
And also because engineers have a can-do attitude. It's one of the things I deal with engineers a lot, and this is no disrespect to Drac, no disrespect to my sister, my family, all my friends who are engineers. But you sit there with an engineer, and the engineers will always look at a problem and go, yes, I can solve this. I can do this. And sometimes you have to ask them a question of, is that a good thing to solve it? And the second question, and this is the big thing, can you really solve it, or can you solve it in theory when you're doing all these things? Because quite a lot of engineers, and scientists, they have a wonderful thing in their mind of where it will work. It will work perfectly in their mind. And especially some of the ones who work in research, they don't bump into the real world, as I call it, often enough, because in them everything works perfectly. And then when it's dealing with the real world, it doesn't work quite as well. And they're sitting there and they honestly, they will keep saying, oh, just give me a couple more years, give me another 6 months, give me another. And the politicians and the leaders will often be sucked down that path because they are such genuine people. They're not salesmen, they're not these things. They're genuine people and they genuinely believe they can solve the problem. And no one is more distraught when it fails than they are.
It's the old thing is perfect is the enemy of good enough.
Yeah.
You could, in theory, build a perfect anti-shipping laser that can obviously fire at the speed of light and knock down everything in the sky, but it's going to take, to pick up another tired old saying, it'll take you like 99%. What's the old saying? No, you can get a 99% solution for 1% of the funding, or you can get 100. That last 1% will be the other 99% of the funding. So it's like you could make, as we've been discussing, a mixture of effectively taking the old mid to late World War II gun-based solution, and you could get a system that's 99% effective on a relatively cheap budget, or you could spend 4 decades throwing money down a black hole trying to make a laser that will do the job slightly better, but will take you 4 decades and billions of dollars, and still doesn't actually work.
Which brings us back to flak and chaff, and the sort of lessons we can extrapolate from ideas being thrown out.
That flak field, and this is something which we didn't think about, but we're talking about Track's torpedo. Is that metal does have to go somewhere, so it will be dropping down to gravity and will be going into the water. So again, the torpedoes will have to go down deep enough to go underneath the residue of the flak field, which is falling down into the water. They might not have the same level of damage on a torpedo as they would on a missile, but they could cause it problems.
I think when we're talking about flak and everything, the other thing is that I know what Dr. Clark's talking about when it comes to engineers. The other big thing you have to avoid is what I call corridor thinking. And weirdly enough, they're slightly left field example, but I think you'll hopefully see where I'm going with it with flak is look at like the Hatton Garden robbery, if you know about that, Jamie.
No, I don't.
Okay, so Hatton Garden, big lockup. Everyone stores all their valuables in little strong boxes deep in a basement in London. Loads of security, sort of nuclear blast-proof doors, combination lock security guards. You'd need a small army and a lot of explosive to have gone in the front way, or something like an Ocean's 11 style con job to get in. And the people who decided to rob the place just went, yeah, but the walls are like half a meter of concrete, and I can buy a 300 quid concrete drill and just drill a hole through the wall, and then I'm in. And all that fancy gating in the doors doesn't matter because I've just circumvented. Yeah, I've just circumvented the whole thing.
It's your firing arcs argument all over again.
Yeah. And this is what comes down to with the flak thing, is that I think it's a pretty viable defense measure, but we have to be careful to not think it's the be all and end all. Now, and I think this is one of the things where you look at something like Battlestar Galactica and you can see that there is an argument to be made, but you also have to be careful, because in Battlestar Galactica, where again you have no gravity, your flak field will work 360. As long as you can point guns in that direction, it will work fine. Whereas on a planet, you fire it horizontally, you have certain limits, as we discussed with gravity. If you fire it vertically, because let's say somebody's firing a DF-21 at you, it's got to come back down, and you have all this radar and antennas and all very delicate things that don't react very well to hot pieces of metal landing on them at high speeds. So you have to recognize that limitation as well.
Also, to make it up effectively, especially with modern ships, considering the amount of firepower each one carries, and especially before they start doubling their guns again, or maybe having other multi-barrel mounts, there are other options available: treble, quadruple, preferably treble, but double I will accept.
I'll go for octuple, thank you. The pom pom.
Okay, you would. You're going to have to start networking the ships. And we were talking already earlier about the issues with networking. Yes, you can, and this is one thing where lasers can come in. You could set up a laser communications net between the ships within the task group. So literally, you have to get into it. You have to get into the ships on the task group to share and coordinate tactical information. But that means then they have to be within within laser range of each other for the ships to work.
Within line of sight.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it also comes down to these kind of things. We'll talk about operational limitations of backups. It's also operational limitations of new systems, because if you can, again, it's kind of like almost like we're saying with if you invent the torpedo carrying cruise missile, even if you never use it, you force the enemy into a tactical disadvantage because they have to go and now compromise the design of their ships to account for this new weapon. It's the same kind of thing with this communication system. If you can demonstrate an ability to hack into enemy communication systems or not even hack into them, but maybe even disrupt them, then you don't necessarily have to exploit that in battle, because if your enemy knows you can do it, they'll have to invest in something like a laser-based communication system. Okay, so now you can't hack that, but as Dr. Clark just mentioned, you've now forced your enemy to move all their ships into laser range. Maybe not even just pure visual range, but it may be just line of sight, but at minimum laser range of each other, which now means you have forced them into a certain space which they may not necessarily want to be in. Because I mean, we've all seen the happy propaganda photos of a carrier battle group where they're all sailing a few hundred yards apart from each other. But we all know in actual real life, if they're into combat, they're going to be miles apart from each other. They're not going to be sailing all up close and personal. But if you can then force them to come in closer, there's reasons why they spread out that far. You force them closer to each other. Now you've given your enemy a tactical disadvantage without actually having to use a capability, just making sure they know that you have it.
And I think the effective laser range is about, well, let's see, if it's line of sight, depending on how high you're putting the ship, you're probably talking, line of sight is 10 to 12 miles really at sea curvature Earth. Laser, you can possibly eke it out to about 20, 25, but this is not the sort of thing which is going to be secure or secret information. Everyone can work this one out. And that becomes a problem for you, because you then go, right then, so I have to form a daisy chain of distances, which is probably maximum ships can be again away from each other is 20 miles. And if one of those ships goes down, suddenly I've lost ships from the daisy chain.
And pray
don't get the cloud of smoke, which disrupts your laser.
Yeah.
So, or rain or hail or
sailing into a fog bank, we now can't talk to each other without the enemy hearing.
Yeah.
It's always these kind of things. There's especially with modern technology, because there's so many ins to an enemy's defense. There's all sorts of things you can do where, as long as you've demonstrated that capability, you don't really have to take it much further than that, because there's so many bits and pieces of modern naval tech which are so vital to the running and fighting capability of a ship. Just showing that you can do it means that your enemy has to react. And if your enemy has to react by spending ridiculous amounts of money reinventing, resecuring, and modifying their ships, you can actually keep a much larger enemy on their toes for a very long period of time at massive expense to them, with relatively minimal investment for yourself.
And if you consider the communication system, okay, let's say, so with first generation laser, might be visual spectrum laser based. Okay, so that's going to do a fog bank. Okay, so how do we deal with that? Are we going to go ultraviolet? Or the data carriage of that is not great. You just heard Drax's reaction the moment me saying it went, and it just came out immediately. Okay, so are we going the other end of the spectrum, which just means are we going infrared? Are we going microwave? All these things come with their own issues. And then you get back to the system and go, oh, yes, okay, so we get back to satellite-based communications. Well, satellite comms is data-heavy like anything, and you need the satellites up there. And the trouble is communication satellites, they're not necessarily as safe as we'd like to presume they are from either hacking or possibly being taken out in a war. And the thing is, again, if you want to have fun with flak, stick up a missile up at about the altitude of communication satellites, blow it up, and just watch what that does. That every satellite it takes out will turn into its own shield of flak, which will just keep going on, a self-perpetuating flak, until eventually you'll turn space into a no-go area for human flight. But leave that to one side. You can take out the communications and probably the GPS rig that way eventually, because there'll be so much shrapnel going around. Eventually, it'll probably reach the altitude of the GPS.
All sorts of things. Not to mention the recent Russian experiments to superheat the ionosphere to block the signal. But anyway, one final element of inspiration, I suppose, from the game that I saw was it's basically a deployable missile which gives a pulse to take down incoming missiles. It doesn't say in the game what it is. My immediate reaction was some form of EMP pulse. Now, we've heard of EMP based weapons coming online now. They're designed to take out power grids, power stations, power networks. Is this a much more expensive and therefore more appealing to tech companies' answer to flak/chaff? Put out your drone with its EMP pulse generator orbiting your fleet to knock out all those very delicate miniaturized sensors / guidance systems / algorithms flying at you at various factors of Mach speed.
There's one problem if you're using an EMP weapon. And I'm going to jump in before Drac, even though I know he has a great answer lined up. But there is one problem. And that is, if you aren't able to control it very, very carefully, you are probably going to take out your own systems as well. And the Americans have been looking at EMP, the Brits have been looking at EMP for about 50 or so years, if not longer. Its effects have been known for a while. Because, let's be honest, its effects aren't too dissimilar to the effects of a solar flare. It's not fun. If you get those calibrations in even slightly wrong, you end up doing more damage to your force than you've done to the enemy, and suddenly those missiles are coming in and they've got no threat. They've got nothing to fire back.
If you go all the way back to the first big unintentional deployment of EMP with the Starfish Prime high altitude tests. They thought it would have one effect. They accidentally ended up knocking out half of Hawaii, which is was like, that was not intentional. Quietly pretend nothing happened.
Several thousands of kilometers away.
Yeah, but it's unpredictable. I mean, I think it could be a potential if it can be more
corrected.
More correct, more. I guess even miniaturized, because as Dr. Clark says, you don't want to set off an absolutely colossal EMP that can travel all the way back and knock out your own ships.
But we're talking if you've got a cruise missile which at the moment flies over a power grid or a network hub of some kind, that's an area effect. I would imagine it's not necessarily going to be hundreds of kilometers. It would be I would imagine.
The thing is, because it's a technology that's been known about for a while and in and of itself doesn't carry a physical level of disruption, it can be protected against to an extent. And this is kind of the sliding scale. If you have some kind of missile deployable EMP warhead of a reasonable level of destructive scale, it will have an effect on your enemy, because the fact that it's more about the reaction. The fact that you have it forces your enemy to try and harden their facilities and their weapons. Now, you can harden electronics against EMP to a certain degree. A lot of people seem to believe that just because it says hardened against EMP, that means you're immune. It's like, no, it means you have a degree of protection. a powerful enough EMP will still fry it. I mean, if we get another, I forgot what the name of the blasted thing is. It's on the tip of my tongue. The massive solar flare event we had back in the 1860s.
That wiped out quite a lot of communications around the world.
Yeah, and for people who aren't aware of that, that was a solar flare that induced a global EMP so strong that you could send telegraphs without the telegraph cables having to have power connected to them, because they were just picking up enough inducted current, even though the telegraph cables ran under the sea, which is usually a fairly good damper against those kind of things. And yeah, some telegraph stations were shorting out and melting just because of the sheer amount of inducted current. If we got something like that these days, it doesn't matter how hardened your EMP claims to be, unless you're surrounded by a literal hemisphere of copper that's earthed to the ground, you're not coming out of it in very good shape. Carrington event, that was it. The Carrington event. So high enough yield EMP will still fry systems, but if there's a limited yield to what you can stick on a missile, putting in EMP shielding, EMP hardening does have a weight penalty, and it does have a certain design penalty as well, because you can't be quite as free with the layout of things. And that in and of itself will probably have more of an effect than the EMP weapon would actually have in a practical battlefield use, because if you're making your enemy, again, you're forcing your enemy to have heavier ships, heavier weapons that are basically carrying this deadweight EMP protection on the off chance you might use it, then unless and until they come up with the same thing and can basically do the same thing back to you, their weapons will be at a disadvantage, because you've got the same technological level and you're building, let's say, a 2-ton cruise missile. If one side has to put 100 kilos of EMP hardening into it and the other side doesn't, because one side has EMP warheads and the other side doesn't, well, then in effect, what you've got is a 1,900 kilogram cruise missile versus a 2,000 kilogram cruise missile, at which point the 2,000 kilogram cruise missile has an advantage because it can either fly further or carry more bang, or better sensors.
I would say one thing, though. Well, as we brought up the Carrington event, I was involved in some actual worst case scenario planning for the Earth. It was one of those sort of, not quite, I wouldn't call war gaming, but it's one of the things which happened at King's. And
simulation.
We'll call it a simulation, but it's more a simulation would require something like some sort of far more official, or hypothetical discussions between a load of academics. Anyway, this one, the common consensus I have to agree is if we had a Carrington scale event these days, the modern world as we know, we think we've been disrupted by COVID. We think we've been disrupted by these sort of viruses. They are nothing compared to what would happen with a modern Carrington event. Because think about how much of your life would be destroyed. No one's phone would survive. No one's computer would survive.
Most people's cars
would be gone. My Subaru might survive, but that's because it's a Subaru and they're virtually indestructible. It's kind of like Toyota pickups.
The old school, this is the thing, it's like old school mechanical cars with no internal computers would be fine. Yeah. The National Steam Museum in York would now become the single most important strategic reserve of railway rolling stock on the planet.
Yes.
Because you can't EMP a steam train.
Frankly, Britain, with its numerous steam railways and density of steam rails versus population, would suddenly become one of the industrial powers of the age. China, which also has some steam trains, might actually also do quite well. America, sorry, your entire infrastructure's gone.
Yeah. And the thing is, when you think about an event of that scale, and I think this actually more, especially when you consider it actually has a tangential connection to Battlestar Galactica as well, because when you consider how vulnerable is the overall civilian populace and infrastructure, because as good as Galactica was, it had to escort a convoy of civilian ships that really couldn't defend themselves against so much as a meteorite, let alone a Cylon raider. And the less said about what happened to the 13 colonies, the better. But
seriously, the 13 colonies, the defense, they had no reason to have a navigation computer software in them. Why the frick are they so weak?
But it's the same kind of vulnerability of, you could, in theory, maybe have some of the military hardware would survive a Carrington event if they were really lucky. But if the entire civilian infrastructure, which mostly isn't EMP hardened, has gone the way of the dodo, it's like, yeah, you might have emergency generators on your base to deal with a temporary loss of power. But what do you do when every
you want to
single...
be in a nuclear submarine which is subject to that much EMP?
Yeah, but it's like, what do you do if you're on your base and you have your generator running, but all of a sudden you're now faced with the fact that every single power station, civilian power station, has gone offline, and all the very delicate, very difficult to replace ceramic transformer elements, of which there are only 2 factories in the world with slow production rates, they've all now blown. So there's 1 factory in China, 1 factory in the States. That's all. And I think they manufacture on, like, you can count the number of full sets they manufacture per year on one or 2 hands. You're not going to replace the global power grid anytime soon. So eventually your generators are going to run out of fuel. If your vehicles...
Again, that's not the scale we're talking about. We're talking about the scale of a not very well operated, a aged and dilapidated television set in Wales.
Yeah, and that look at the damage that caused. What we're talking about is something even
No, I get that. I get that, but I'm talking about the scale of area defense for a battle fleet.
Yes.
So we don't need the nuke
global catastrophe
exploded in low orbit. All we need is a old cathode TV sparking on a well, I don't know.
If I was the Chinese Navy, I'd be very worried if they started getting televisions delivered from the UK.
This TV, I think, was somehow screwed up with the ADSL network. So I'm not sure how much power EMP takes. I imagine it's quite a bit.
To be honest though, I think the use of EMP on the battlefield, because hardening techniques do exist, would probably be more of that disruption of enemy capability by forcing them to design against it more than an active battlefield use. Because once those things are hardened, you've only got 2 choices: either ramp up the power somehow, or it's just not effective. But where I think the reason we were kind of going down the line with the Carrington event possible scenarios is that actually, once you've got those kind of EMP generators weaponized, they're actually probably far more practically used against the enemy infrastructure.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is a form of warfare. If you can disable the enemy infrastructure, it makes it much harder for them to deploy their units, because you can have as many advanced ships and everything as you like, but if you've used a bunch of cruise missiles with EMP warheads to strategically knock out power grids and
every politician, senior leader with a pacemaker,
major truck parks and things like that, then you can have as many ships as you like in dock. But if let's say your oil refinery with all your ship's bunker fuel is 50 miles away and it relies on a computerized pumping system to get that fuel to your naval base, your ships aren't going anywhere because they don't have fuel, and you can't truck it along. I mean, I'd love to see someone try and refuel a carrier using using the little oil tankers they use to refuel petrol stations. But even if they try,
a uniquely British problem.
Yeah, if the EMP has knocked out the electronic control, the engine control systems in your trucks, you have a problem there. And even with a nuclear power carrier, your fighters need jet fuel. Where's that going to come from? If your jet fuel transport vehicles and pumps and everything aren't working, you physically can't supply the ship. You're cutting off the military by cutting them off at the knees by knocking out the civilian infrastructure they rely on to support them. And then you have the double whammy of, even if they somehow manage to scrape together enough jet fuel and enough fuel for the escorts and so on and so forth, and they manage to communicate with all the crew who are scattered around in the civilian population with no means of communication anymore, and you somehow manage to scrape a fleet together to go out, you're now fighting with missiles and ships that are carrying tons of Faraday cages and other EMP hardening against an enemy that probably doesn't have them, and therefore has more capable weaponry. And can also go back home and get their ships repaired if you manage to damage them, and you can't because everyone's dock cranes are fused in place.
So I guess the answer to the question I posed at the beginning of all this is sci-fi worth it when it comes to thinking about the future of warfare? The answer is it was worth almost 3 hours of us chatting here. We were dissecting the different possibilities and permutations thereof. So
to be fair, I'm not sure if
that's
a great metric, because we can have 3 hours discussion started by just one of us ranting about something particularly annoying that day.
So I guess that's the point, isn't it? It depends. It depends on the discussion that leads you down and whether or not you can then turn that discussion into some form of quantifiable reality.
Yeah, and I think for me the two main things with sci-fi is, one, generally speaking, most sci-fi is not written by military people, which means you get a fresh take on how to use technology, which is always important because in almost any field, it's very easy to become very tunnel visioned. So just having somebody write a bit of sci-fi is like, we're going to use these weapons, which we're going to loosely base on real world analogs, so we understand what they're going on about. But we're going to use them in this way. It might not work. It may just be pure fantasy, but it might also represent a completely fresh way of thinking that people just haven't imagined because it's not come up in military circles before. But as we've been saying, it also just provides a very good way of looking at potential future iterations of weapons, going, well, how would this work? We're not necessarily thinking about it now because we don't have spaceborne vessels right now, but how would this work, and how can we backtrace that into things working in the real world? Because it's all interlinked. At the end of the day, it's all human minds creating the weapons of war. Human minds are creating the sci-fi scenarios and their weapons of war. So there are going to be analogies, and it widens our field of knowledge. And let's face it, just because it's sci-fi and just because there might be some really weird and wonderful things out there like Borg assimilation beams or whatever, that will have no real world counterpart, there's an awful lot of military programs that were designed by very clever military people that never went anywhere because they turned out to be complete boondoggles.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and
the Borg assimilation beam could be quite useful.
Yes. But I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind is the Sergeant York and its desperate attempts to shoot down the portable loose fan, and then go on to try and assassinate the commanding brass that were watching it all. Then again, are we entirely sure that AIs don't walk among us? Perhaps this was an attempt at a first strike. But yeah, it's the thing. It's like you always have to remember that just because it has the word military appended to it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work. There are even systems that can actually make it into military service that turn out to not really be worth the paper that was used to design them.
I don't think we should talk about the sea slug that often. It's just not good.
I mean, it was good for demoralizing people when what appeared to be the first stage of a Saturn V came roaring over their heads, but that was about it. But,
yeah, the sea slug was pretty much that.
But I mean, given that we've been talking a lot about anti-aircraft defense and flak and stuff, you can actually look back and see the Type 3 shells that the Japanese Navy used. Fantastic in principle, useless in practice. The less said about the unrotated projectile launchers and their attempt to mine their own mothership, the better. And it's like, those were designed by some very clever military people, and I can guarantee you there would have been a bunch of people writing early sci-fi in the 1930s who were probably talking about all sorts of weird and wonderful air defense weapons. But I bet if you go through them, you'll probably find a ton of systems in those sci-fi novels from the 30s that, if they either had equivalents built later on, or you can think about how they would have been built, their systems would have worked a hell of a lot better than those ones I just mentioned.
Yes, the unrotated projectile that's caused a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But the amount of the thing that I think is interesting and that comes about that I often find with sci-fi interesting, and the limitation I find is you often, because of budgets, have a scientist who's somehow kind of wonderkind in everything of science. For example, I usually bring up the example of Dr. Samantha Carter, Colonel Samantha Carter from SG-1, who, if there really was such an amazing scientist, and I have to say, Amanda Turing, who played Tapping, did an amazing job, and it was always a really believable character. But there was part of me which was always going, if there really was a scientist who was this good at everything, you would never allow them to flick off planet, because losing them would be a national disaster. Okay, they just wouldn't be allowed to go she would not be sent away to run Atlantis or anything like that. It would be that higher priority to keep her safe, alive, and working, probably in a lab somewhere.
Just wrap her in an industrial-sized bale of bubble wrap.
Yes, literally. Just the real world scientist.
Although to be fair, SG-1 did miss a trick because for all of her brilliance, she never developed a sarcasm-powered weapon. Because if you'd invented that and given it to Jack O'Neill, the whole thing, the Gould would have been gone by the mid season 2.
Oh yes. Oh.
And with that, we'd better leave it, I suspect.
Yes.
I think we've also started out what the next one will be on, something to do with Stargate, probably, knowing us three.
Yeah.
Or if you would like to see more of us doing this, and if you would specifically like Stargate, I'm going to do the thing of rigging the bait now. Right. Jamie Ragnavote, if you would like Stargate, please comment below and say you'd like Stargate.
All right, I'll leave it up to you to find the footage.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you're the footage guy. I'll give you that task.
I'm sure there's a mod for Stellaris that will do Stargate. There's a mod for Stellaris that will do practically anything. And if there's not, there'll be a homeworld mod.
We'll have to rely on that one for Babylon 5.
Yes.
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 Thanks for listening to Bilge Pumps' deep dive into Battlestar Galactica.
Escort clear zone intact.
Incoming!
Lords of Kobol, watch over us.
Krista, I'm taking this!
Your life is no longer yours to throw away.
Just give me one good shot. Strike!
Firing on target!
For Colonial Fleet, for the 12 colonies. Nothing but the rain.